The game I'd like to look at from round 4 of the Bilbao Masters is Magnus Carlsen against Wesley So. Actually, I wanted to spread things out a bit and look at a game by some of the other players, but the world champion is responsible for all the interesting action in Bilbao at the moment. E4 from Carlsen, and Wesley So plays very solidly with E5, and we have a Spanish and now the Berlin variation. Now, instead of going for the Berlin endgame, Carlsen plays D3, which of course keeps more tension in the position, just solidly protecting the E pawn, and this is really the most popular way of handling the Berlin at the top levels at the moment. Bishop C5, an active development of the bishop, and Carlsen exchanges on C6. You don't have to play this, but this, you might recall, is a very trendy line at the moment, played in the candidates tournament and played by Wei Yi in Vaikonze, winning a spectacular game. And well, this variation with knight d2, this is really pioneered by Anand. Played this in many games, but Caruana has also played this, Carlsen. And yeah, after castles, Queen e2, and we've seen this, that white likes to castle queenside. Wei Yi played this spectacular game in Vaikonze against Navarra. You might recall that from this Power Play Chess YouTube channel. We took a look at that, and Caruana defeated Nakamura in the candidates tournament a little earlier in the year by playing castles. Played it in a slightly different way, delayed his pawn storm on the king side, but it did come a little bit later with G and H pawns. But instead of knight d2, Carlsen did something a little bit different. He played Queen e2. Now, what are the differences between this and knight d2? Well, it's pretty subtle. First thing is that black has to deal with the threat of knight e5 in this position, so you can't just castle here. That pawn can just be taken. If knight d2 castles knight e5 here, not a good move because of queen d4 threatening the knight and threatening f2. But with the queen on e2, I hope you're concentrating, then knight e5 is a threat because queen d4 doesn't actually threaten f2. So after queen e2, black has to deal with the immediate threat of knight takes pawn, and in a sense he has to commit himself straight away. How should he defend this pawn? Well, it's been played a few times before. Topalov, for example, against Rajabov played bishop g4, and well, it's quite clear that after this trade, white is slightly better. I mean, this is a very unpretentious way for black to develop. White has the better structure, but black has got rid of this bishop, which doesn't achieve too much. But in this game, Wesley played Queen e7, defending the pawn. Now Carlsen played knight d2. I see from my database that h3 was played, and then knight d2, and black castled queenside, and this was played in the game Wahlbrot against Metger from Berlin 1897. So there you go. There's nothing new under the sun. Over 100 years ago they were playing in this way. Let's go back. But instead of h3, Carlsen saw no need to prevent bishop g4, or indeed knight g4, and played knight d2. So it's very similar to this original knight d2 variation. Now, black could castle, and we get something very similar to those lines, the original knight d2 lines, but I think this is a slightly better version because the queen is perhaps not so well placed on e7. White's ready to castle queenside, and this pawn storm will probably come, but also that queen could be vulnerable on e7 to an attack by the knight on f5, as we're going to see in this game. Wesley played bishop g4. h3, well, Carlsen has no objection to grabbing back one of the bishops. But this would be a reasonable way for black to play. Black would very much like to spin this knight round to e6 to control these squares, and this is an unpretentious way of playing. White is slightly better, but black is very solid. But bishop h5, it's a more provocative way of playing, of course, because black wants to tempt this pawn forward. Let's just have a little look and see what happens if that takes place. Now, there was a game I found in my database where the Cuban player Bruzon played this with black, and we can see how white has to be a little bit careful if he plays g4. Of course, g4 looks very inviting. It seems like you're on the attack. But just look what happens. You'll notice that in playing g4, it slightly weakens the f4 square, or not even slightly. This is the continuation of the game, and black is at least equal here, because that knight comes around to e6 and can later on move into f4. I mean, white is still okay here, but black certainly shouldn't have any difficulties. So this is, or potentially can be, the drawback of playing g4. So what did Carlsen do? Well, he played a tricky little move, a3. I think one of the main points of this move is that it keeps all white's options open. White still might go for g4, still might play knight c4. White still hasn't committed the king. He's waiting to see how black plays and might advance with b4. I mean, black could prevent this with a5, but that probably rules out queenside castling. And then perhaps knight c4, perhaps knight f1, with the knight coming around here, or perhaps here. And white waits to see where black commits his king. But Wesley played knight d7, so this is a typical move, but wasn't fussed about b4. But this is interesting, because now Carlsen is playing potentially on both sides of the board. Black probably doesn't want to castle queenside here, because white has a very natural plan to play, well, probably a4 and b5 to attack on the queenside. But this space is rather pleasant for white, actually, in any case. But white still might come back and play on the king side as well, as happened. f6, knight e3. So we can see the drawback of playing that queen to e7, and I have to question that move way back on move 6, because this is such an inviting plan for white. And already we can see that black is in slight difficulties. For example, what happens if we anticipate the knight f5 and play queen e6? Well, here white has a tactic, knight g5. This wins a pawn. Well, if pawn takes, then queen check, and if bishop takes, queen, knight e6. So threatening here and threatening here, white wins a pawn. What about queen f7, anticipating knight f5? Well, then knight f5 anyway. Now watch this tactic. If black plays the most natural move on the board, castles kingside, then bishop h6, very nasty. If that's taken, there's a knight fork. So this is not simple. Well, Wesley decided to break up white's queenside pawns with a5, but and although on the surface of it, well, let's throw in knight f5 first, of course, attack the queen. And now here, again, there's a slight problem. You know, where do you put the queen? Do you play queen f7? But once again, that invites, after castles, this move bishop h6, this nasty tactic. So instead Wesley played queen f8, but not great, because, well, castles, of course, is delayed for a long time. So anyway, these pawns were broken up on the queen side, and at first you'd think that, well, this looks quite promising for black, because suddenly there's, you know, perhaps threats against this isolated a pawn. But in fact, you have to look at it from White's viewpoint, that actually the b file has opened, and it's very hard for Black to take control on the queenside when he simply isn't developed, he isn't castled. And White still has this beautiful knight on f5. So it's the combination of play on both sides of the board that's very unpleasant for Black. So Carlsen simply castled here. Obviously that can't be taken because there's, the g-pawn is threatened. And now Wesley played queen f7. Well, I think, you know, this shuffling with the queen is clearly an indication that Wesley has lost the plot a bit around here. a4 from Carlsen. Knight c5. And now White could simply play, for example, bishop d2 and spin the rook over, and this looks very promising. Well, here's a little tactic. Black should probably switch the queen over, but if b6, then that pawn can be taken, of course, after pawn takes rook, knight takes bishop, and another knight fork. And that knight on f5 is beautiful beast. So bishop d2 was good, but Carlsen played a slightly unusual move, and I have a feeling that Wesley probably did not anticipate this. Queen threatens the rook. Pawn covers the rook, and now knight d2. This was the point of this little backward step from the queen, that suddenly this knight spins around to c4, and it's highly unpleasant for Black now. Wesley took on a4, but now knight c4, threatening the bishop, which retreated to f8. Bishop e7 is probably better, but this is still a horrible position for Black. It's still not possible to castle. This actually loses material straight away. Let's just have a look at this as a forced variation. And after this, White is a piece up. You can take the queen, that just gets recaptured. So after bishop e7, Black probably has to play the king to d7. This is not a good place for the king. And after f4, I think White's initiative is just overwhelming, actually. I can't see Black surviving this. But Wesley played bishop f8, which really is not looking good for Black. And Carlsen played bishop e3, so now there are threats just to enter on the queen side with a direct attack. King d7, Carlsen builds up. Well, what's White threatening? Well, let's see. Bishop g6. I can take on b6. Take on c5. Obviously, if that's recaptured, then we take here. So rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes, and rook a7. So very, very simple, basic exchanges, and that leads to an overwhelming attack for Black. So simple tactics, and Black really can't deal with this very well at all. The king is just in a desperate position, and you can see with the rook way out of play, Black simply can't defend this. Wesley tried knight takes pawn. Now, if pawn takes knight, then queen takes, and Black is actually surviving now, because if check, king c8, and the king will actually find safety here. Now you compare this with the game. This is very interesting. It's that pawn on c7 covers the king. In the game, after knight e4, Carlsen first played knight takes b6, and only then took on e4. So now the 7th rank is open, so no pawn on c7. Wesley played queen c4. This is exactly the same as the other variation, but no pawn on c7. Check, king c7, knock the bishop back. The point of that is that now White can play rook fd1. Now, notice the difference. The king can't hide here because, well, queen and the rook are coming in. There's absolutely no defence here. And Wesley resigned. For example, if bishop c5, the queen comes in. Let's exchange that off. If pawn takes, then knight d6. Well, there are various other variations, but it is absolutely crushing. well, 26 moves. That's where Wesley resigned. 26 moves, and Magnus, just in imperious form, he's switching from kingside to queenside and back again. Just completely confused Wesley. And this is what Magnus is brilliant at, just playing moves which are somehow really unpleasant for his opponent. And clearly Wesley was caught in two minds, at least two minds, in this game, and just didn't find a coherent strategy to deal with Magnus's tricky moves. Brilliant play from Magnus. So after a first round loss, he stormed back with 3 wins in a row, and well, in the next round he plays Anish Giri. Not an easy opponent for Magnus, so we await to see what happens there.